Shalom, I'm Rabbi Gail Schuster-Buskila, and today I'd like to talk to you about the second Torah portion, Parashat Vaere, in the book of Exodus, and it begins, in my mind, with the problem of dealing with God. For me, it is very difficult to deal with a God that is so closely connected to the people of Israel. If this book, this Tanakh, this Bible, is what you feel is from God, then I'm not sure we have a common ground of discussion. But if you're searching, or if you're wondering, or if you're trying to find a way to deal with a book that deals with revelation, and you don't believe in a supernatural revelation, then I think we have a lot in common and a lot that we can discuss. The two pictures behind me are not actually just by accident. This one was a gimel made by my mother at needlepoint, and that one is a picture of my great teacher, Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan. We'll talk more about his ideas, his theology, and in a second you'll see that I've titled my discussion today as Theology Now. Well, I do love to talk about God. As you can see, I've named this particular parasha, Midrash for Parashat Vaere, so many names for God. You can see here in verse 3 of Exodus 6, my name Yud He W He, I did not reveal to them. Now, if you click on this, you will reach my glossary page, where you will see that the Yud He Vav He I've used is parallel to the YHWH that I use is parallel to the Yud He Vav He, the ancient name of God, not Elohim, which is this word, which is God, but I use Yud YHWH. When reading, I call it Yahweh. We don't really know how it's pronounced, but I think it's important to look at it differently than just Lord. Lord has all different sorts of meanings in English, and when I translated the verses, did not actually agree with it. But something happened in Exodus, and oddly enough, that Yud He Vav He did not reveal himself to our ancestors. And my Midrash begins, every generation has its own myths and truths. Each one differs from the next. So does the perception of God. What divine configuration do we perceive? Oseh Shalom, peacemaker from afar. Now I've gone over, instead of continuing in Exodus, I've gone over to a verse from Job, making peace in the most exalted places. Job suffered a great deal. And that was his connection to God? Do we wish we could hold fast to that image, even though no image of God can ever really be grasped? The next verse I've quoted is from Psalm 55. Cast your burdens onto Yahweh, who will sustain you. No righteous will ever be allowed to stumble. Fascinating verse. A question for us comes because of the desire or the need for some connection outside of ourselves, maybe that will protect us, maybe that will sustain us, as it says here. It's not clear. Let's talk a little more about God. Of course, when we're talking about God and people dealing with biblical connections to God, it's rather hard to know what these real encounters were. And as Professor James L. Kugel says in his book, The Great Shift, Encountering God in Biblical Times, what did the first audience of these stories assume about God and about seeing? what made these accounts seem plausible and realistic, and even realistic? If one considers as a whole the Bible's various narrations of people's encounters with the divine, a pattern emerges, not in every case, to be sure, but in quite a few. The people involved suddenly meet up with God. But is this normal seeing? As you can see on my website, the section called Theology has quite a few links, and I speak about the metaphorical or poetical but not literal world of God as revelation at Sinai or at any part of the Bible. I do highly recommend the lecture by Professor Shia J.D. Cohen from Harvard, The Image of God and the Names of God. Fascinating. But I'd like to read what my rabbi, whose picture you saw behind me, said in his book, The Future of the American Jew, in 1976. He was the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, although European-born, was one of the first English-speaking rabbis to be ordained, and he was ordained in what is now the conservative movement at the beginning of the 20th century. And he says, in this age of electricity, our conception of lightning is very different from the conception of it held in all ancient mythologies, which viewed it as a weapon of the gods. Nevertheless, lightning is as much a fact as it ever was. Similarly, the reality of God is as true as ever, despite the dissipation of the thick clouds of miracle with which tradition enveloped it. I invite you to look at many more of these ideas that I've listed here. I certainly can't go through all of them. I'd love to talk about this more, and I probably will, because as we know, God is in the book. My Midrash goes on to something slightly different, and this is what I say. So, if so many of our forefathers were reported to be called to divine encounters, why weren't our foremothers called to journey to encounter the divine presence? Is it possible they never needed to travel far to sense God's presence? I'll just read one verse of this poem that I wrote. They were always waiting patiently for the Shekhinah to settle down beside them at the fire and to rock the cradle through their fingertips. I end this Midrash with a quote from the book of Psalms, chapter 63. Yes, I have imagined your holiness, to see your power and glory. My soul thirsts for you, and my flesh yearns for you. If you go on to the website, you'll hear a beautiful rendition of this very section from the book of Psalms. Well, when it comes to God, I believe it is an infinitely discussable idea. And I hope that you have enjoyed my beginning of a discussion of it. I do believe we'll come back to God because of the connection between the perception of the Jewish people and their God, Yahweh. That's Yud-Hey, W-Hey, or Elohim. There's so many names of God, as we talked about, and yet the divine is something that I also feel in the world. And I feel it, but maybe not in a way that deals with exclusive connection between a higher power and the Jewish people. Maybe I think that we as a human species have found a way to understand the cosmos and to be connected to the world. And the way our ancestors perceived it was to show us the way of the book of Exodus. Shabbat Shalom, Parashat Vaere.